wrote my autobiography, The Fiddler and His Bow, nearly a quarter of a century ago, although it wasn't published until 5 or 6 years ago, and in a sense it is only a partial autobiography. Very few poets have actually written autobiographies, and many of them are not very satisfactory, and sometimes perhaps the objectivity of post-mortem biography is better, but nevertheless I think the poet's own voice can be quite useful in terms of revealing things that a biographer simply could not possibly know. I wrote poetry, a great deal of poetry, continuously from being about 18 for a period of about 20 years, and then I had a block of 20 years. And at the end of this period of a block, the first thing I did was not to write poetry, but to write my autobiography, which was somehow getting into my stride again as a writer. And I chose as a cover a picture of Briggate, which is one of the main thoroughfares of Leeds, which was taken in the 1960s when I was a student in Leeds at Leeds Training College, which is what we all called it, because the real name was University of Leeds Institute of Education, College of Education, which was clearly an impossible mouthful. It then moved later under Leeds Met University, which is now rechristening itself Leeds Beckett University. So in a sense the title has gone full circle. I chose as a cover for my book, as I said, a picture of Briggate in the 1960s, which I had tinted in pink. The original perhaps was clearer, but it was a very faded black and white, and only someone who was there at the time would know the buses in it were Corporation Green. Leeds has changed unbelievably since then. Being more or less housebound, it's a long time since I've been there, but I can see it on the internet, and most of it is simply unrecognisable. The street I was born in, Bridgewater Place, was one of half a dozen streets belonging to what was then the railway company, and they were long demolished 30, 40 years ago to make way for an inner ring road that never actually was built. And the title, strangely, is resurfaced in a lavish block of apartments with penthouses, perhaps 10 minutes walk from where the original Bridgewater Place was. I'll read two extracts, one dealing with my early childhood and one dealing with my period as a student. I was born on the 8th of January 1942 at 22 Bridgewater Place, Leeds 9. The houses were back-to-backs, built for the North Eastern Railway Company. Now a few cobbles remain at the mouth of the construction site, and an overarching bridge to nowhere, under which in my childhood goods trains passed, heavy with coal and clinker. Once the 6 double house rows were red brick, but in my memory they are chiaroscuro, in places polished by the passing of a myriad souls in work-blackened overalls. The tiny working-class community was bordered on one side by a railway goods yard, on another by the River Aire, and on the third by a busy main road. Across the road there had once been dozens more streets, but they disappeared in a long-forgotten slum clearance drive in the 1930s. In their place, weeds grew over filled-in cellars and cracked windowsills at crazy angles, making megaliths to a community whose only memory lay in street names on old city maps. The school I attended was perched on top of a hill, and is there still, its windows boarded up. Bits of walls have been demolished. Gypsies, or what pass for gypsies, have their white and silver-ribboned caravans in the yard. There is an air of imminent destruction. The row of shops that serve the streets has gone within the last few weeks. Where the pub stood is a few square feet of coloured mosaic tiles. It is there, but not there. Like my own life, buried under happenings of present and recent pasts. But there is a point of absolute finitude beyond which neither destruction nor perception can go, a zero of earth and stone, around which hover the ghosts of the living. I can conjure those ghosts, remembering and repeating the ritual of a childhood game. Farmer, farmer, may I cross your golden fields? And the reply, only if you are wearing something yellow. We would rush and leap to avoid the hands of the one whose turn it was to be the farmer in the endless summer evenings by the locked petrol pumps and the empty news vendor's stall. In 1942, the year I was born, the war was halfway through. Beneath our house was a cellar, where on the one occasion I can remember an air raid, we sheltered until the sirens wailed all clear. To me, our cellar was mysterious and magical. The stone steps with a sudden turn near the top, a pathway to paradise. The floor was concrete, erupting here and there like a body saw, with the earth showing through, moon craters or the stone breasts of the Indian goddess Saraswati. In later years, when I read Melanie Klein, I could read a more complex symbolism into this memory. There was a stone slab where earlier generations had put food to keep it fresh, and there my father kept a rusty iron last for shoe repairs. My mother had a small metal cupboard for food storage, known as a keeping safe, painted green with wire mesh on the sides to allow air to circulate. Next to the main cellar was a smaller cellar for coal storage. Each week the coalmen, with their grimed faces and flashing whites of their eyes, heaved bag after bag from open-backed lorries. They lifted the steel grating, pulling back its securing chain like raising a tiny portcullis. They sent the coal thundering down, rumbling and roaring, rather like the poem of Robert Frost in which he depicts the pouring of freshly picked apples into a stone store cellar. There was a third cellar, tiny and almost totally dark, and only large enough for a child to stand upright in. At the back, bricks had been loosened, so that in case of the house being bombed, the family could escape into the cellar of the house behind. The walls of the main cellar were whitewashed over unevenly plastered bricks, their outline showing through here and there. Light from the street filtered through a tiny cobweb window. A low wattage bulb burned dimly in its socket. Here for hours I would experiment, making medicines from water and coloured chalks, or use a bicycle lamp to project misty outlines from the negatives of family snapshots onto the whitewashed walls. Upstairs was the living room, where we ate and relaxed. The fire provided the focus of the room. It may be D.H. Lawrence Hocus Pocus, but I prefer a room that's got a focus, W.H. Auden wrote. In our case it was a Yorkist range, a combined oven and fireplace, which once a week my mother would blacklead, wearing thick gloves. After the fire was lit, burning coals had to be raked underneath the oven to heat it. Getting an even temperature was an unlikely affair, but the real coal fire with its glowing castles was an immense stimulus to my childhood imagination. This, I think, set the tone for my life. It was a very, very protected childhood. I know others who lived in a similar kind of background, but whose lives in childhood was not protected, but mine was. Not only was I an only child until I was 11 and we'd moved anyway, but there was a community of families. There was a true working class community, and it was a very protective one, and certainly gave me the beginnings of what was going to become my poetic imagination. And my first muse was a girl called Margaret Gardner, and it was about her I wrote some of, hopefully, my better poems. And when we were 11, we moved away to a council estate, which was very uninspiring, and there was no sense of community. And I passed my 11 plus and went to a dreadful all boys grammar school where I was extremely unhappy. And it was only really when I left there, when I was 18, still uncertain of what to do, and 3 scraped A levels. I taught for a year unqualified in an inner city school, and then, still not knowing what to do, I went to Leeds Training College to train as a teacher. I studied English as a main subject, and strangely, only a few weeks ago, checking through the records, which are now stored in Leeds Met University archives, I discovered that until the year I did my 3-year training college, I could have taken as a secondary subject modern foreign literature, but for some reason, when I was there, presumably through lack of interest, it was dropped, which would have been far better than the history option I chose as a second subject, because history, no doubt, is a great teacher to some, but I never had any kind of feeling for it whatsoever. I'll now read a part of about my time as a student. I had some very good teachers, particularly, strangely, not the head of English, but the head of religious studies, a man known A.E. Elms, and his enthusiasm for the new theology led me to read Rana and Tillich, and stimulated my interest in philosophical theology. I still marvel at my good fortune having such stimulating teachers at such a formative period of my life. I read Flew and MacIntyre's new essays in philosophical theology, which included an essay by Professor John Wisdom, in which he posited the idea of God as an invisible gardener. I'm still not sure, but there are some people whose learning crosses into two fields, and some fascinating articles in the International Journal of Psychoanalysis by someone of the same name. Whether this is the same John Wisdom, I don't know. It probably was, because one of the books we had to read at training college was a book by Susan Isaacs, and I only knew her at that time as a writer of teachers' textbooks, and it was many years later I discovered she was a leading disciple of Melanie Klein and a leading psychoanalyst. And there's another strange crossing over here. When I was a student, I was very much impressed by the work of G.H. Bantock, who had been a lecturer at Leeds Training College, but by the time I was there he had been promoted and was Professor of Education at Leicester University. He was a friend of T.S. Eliot's, who no doubt got him this prestigious job, and he was a disciple of Lewis. And Bantock's books, Freedom and Authority in Education particularly, influenced me considerably while I was actually training as a teacher, before I actually began to teach. Bantock was quite well versed in the Lewisite theology, and he was reasonably versed in philosophy, but his attack on Susan Isaacs was completely ridiculous. And I had the, I will not say fortune or misfortune, I actually did meet Bantock, and as a person he was completely insensitive and crass and vain, and now I would regard him as completely, simply one of the less worthy followers of Eliot and Lewis. Lewis had a good effect on some people, such as Philip Hobsbawm, the founder of the group, but Hobsbawm was never a thoroughgoing Lewisite in the way Bantock was. Bantock was not the only person who was pushed by Eliot. Another person who was pushed by Eliot was the Professor of Education at Leeds at the time, and he was, again, like Bantock, immensely vain. He had a first down in college under Lewis. He taught briefly in a grammar school, and in a matter of a few years, he became Professor of Education at Leeds. And a friend of mine who actually studied under him knew him quite well. And when my friend went to see his professor, the professor said, and how was I today? Clearly, very much an actor on a stage, rather than anyone with a passionate belief in education. The head of my own training college was Professor Roy Rich. He lost his professorial title when, at the age of 31, having been the youngest professor in any subject in any university in the UK, he was Professor of Education at Hull at 31. He wrote a classic on teacher training in the 19th century. He then became principal of Leeds Training College, and he remained there until he retired at 65. I recently had a letter from the son of Niblett, who was then Professor of Education at Leeds University, prior to the professor who I was talking about, who was a successor in later years. It was at Leeds Training College I first began to be a poet. I had three wonderful friends who were girls and muses. Chris, who sadly died in a traffic accident returning from school practice, and Jeannie, who moved to London, and Alison, who moved to Morecambe. And sadly, I've never been able to keep in touch, never found Jeannie. And I did once have a phone number in Morecambe for Alison, but I lost it moving house 25 years ago. But nevertheless, they remain three muses. I had an earlier one and some later ones, but these muses did inspire me to write some of my poems, and particularly to write my one novel, Pitfall Street. I would not advise people to write novels. They're a huge amount of time to write. It took me 5 years of unremitting work to write it, and it was never reviewed, and it's still in print. But perhaps writing prose for a poet is useful to fill in the time between poems and when there is no inspiration. And after all, writing is still writing. I never made the mistake of trying to write for money. I think this is a great tragedy of Stephen Spender, that his strength as a poet was considerably weakened by the amount of energy he gave to book reviewing, lecturing, teaching in American universities, and I think generally wasting his spirit. I think this is true of a number of poets, that they spend the time doing the wrong thing. I think particularly John Ashby, the American poet, was a marvellous translator of Reverie. Would have been much better spending his life translating Reverie's 1,000 pages of poems rather than writing his own poems. I just cannot understand some particular current obsessions. Ashbery's one, and the Irish poet Derek Marn is another. I was reading a new book today which gave a chapter to Marn, and one of the great obsessions is his poem Standing in a Disused Cowshed in County Wexford. I cannot see any depth to this poem. There's no rhythm, there is no rhyme, there is no profundity, there is no philosophy. It's simply a reflection of a disused cowshed in County Wexford. And how anyone can read anything into this poem, I simply do not know. But I'm pleased I wrote my partial autobiography. I'm now 71, and I certainly will never write a second volume. Life since then has become more tragic, more complex, and not something which I could really write about with the degree of objectivity that I can write about my early years. But I certainly hope. I checked on the internet, and it is not, as is the fate of many books, priced at a penny, but quite a few pounds, even though there were several hundred copies in print. I myself have only a couple of copies left, and perhaps if I was younger I would consider having it all put as an online free e-book, but realistically this is simply not going to happen. But I do feel I made my contribution. Spender did in World Within World, but as we learn from his biographers, a great deal of his life was simply omitted. Spender was clearly gay for about 20 years, and this comes across very clearly in his authorised biography, but he simply missed out on his own autobiography. His co-30s writer, Isherwood, was more frank and candid, but less talented. In fact, the only real survivor of the 30s generation was, of course, Auden himself, who managed to edit out of his collected works all his best poems, particularly Spain 1937 and August for the People. I'm trying at the moment to get from America a copy of a book which contains this poem, and I will read it, as there is no version on the internet of even the text, let alone somebody actually reading it. Life has many surprises, and one of the greatest was actually sitting here in my own home at 71 with Brenda Williams, my ex-wife, and co-poet and campaigner, trying to recreate some of the visions that I've had, some of the visions and passions we've shared, and some of the things that only I, as a person, know about my own self, which may be viewed differently by different people, but it is that vision I have that is the inspiration for my own writing, and which, with the help of reading French poetry, may lead me eventually to do some professional translations. I've done a few, but not enough. But it's led me some marvellous poets, Revedy and Rader, and I'm now looking at Patrice de la Tour du Pin, sadly, who has had about 4 poems translated into English, yet whose collected poems in 3 volumes are more than 1,000 pages, and he is a true discovery, one I'm only beginning to dip into now. I'm waiting to find enough money to buy one of his collected poems for about £20, and I'll hopefully do this sometime this year and perhaps begin a few translations of de la Tour du Pin, who is a very neglected poet, not in France, but in this country, which again is very commonplace.